The projector beam cut through cigarette smoke in the darkened recreation hall, and for a moment the German prisoners forgot where they were. It was a Tuesday evening in Camp Stark, New Hampshire, October the 1944, and 300 Wehrmacht soldiers were watching Gary Cooper draw his gun on screen. Outside, beyond the barbed wire, autumn leaves fell on American soil they'd never expected to see except through tank periscopes or rifle scopes. But here they sat, prisoners of war, watching a Western as if they were locals at the town cinema, as if war hadn't torn the world apart, as if they hadn't crossed an ocean in the hull of a Liberty ship expecting interrogation cells and revenge. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that some men unconsciously reached for wallets they no longer carried, forgetting they weren't paying customers but captives, forgetting that the price of admission had been surrender, had been the white flag raised over a destroyed bunker outside St. Lo, had been the long march with hands above heads while American soldiers kept rifles trained on their backs, the smell of popcorn mixed with Lucky Strikes, and the particular odor of too many men in too small a space. But for these 2 hours, none of that mattered. They were somewhere else entirely, somewhere that existed only in silver light and shadow, in the eternal present tense of cinema, where the hero always draws faster, where the girl always loves him back, where the sunset always arrives on cue. The first films had arrived 2 weeks after the camp opened, carried in a truck that also brought winter blankets and medical supplies, as if entertainment were as essential as warmth and medicine. The American commandant, Colonel Morrison, had signed the requisition forms himself, checking the Geneva Convention guidelines twice before approving what his adjutant called that movie business. Morrison was 53 years old, a career soldier who'd fought in the First World War, who'd seen what happened to men when hope drained away, when routine became cage, when the mind turned inward and consumed itself. The prisoners had expected many things when they'd raised their hands in surrender. Rough treatment, certainly. Meager rations, perhaps forced labor. They had steeled themselves for hardship, rehearsed in their minds how they would maintain dignity under harsh conditions, how they would resist interrogation, how they would preserve their honor, even in defeat. What they hadn't expected was Betty Grable dancing across a 40-foot screen while they sat on wooden benches eating popcorn made in the camp kitchen. The corn had been grown in Iowa, harvested by farmers whose sons were fighting in Europe, shipped to New Hampshire, and popped in oil by German prisoners who'd been taught the technique by an American mess sergeant who treated the whole thing as if it were the most normal thing in the world, as if making snacks for enemy soldiers to eat while watching Hollywood musicals was standard military procedure, as if this were what victory looked like. Your enemies sitting quietly in the dark, forgetting to hate you because they're too busy watching Judy Garland sing. Unteroffizier Klaus Brenner would later write to his wife that the strangest moment of his captivity wasn't his capture near St. Lo, wasn't the ocean crossing where he'd been certain the ship would be torpedoed by his own Navy's U-boats, wasn't even setting foot on enemy soil. It was sitting in that darkened hall, watching Cary Grant romance Katharine Hepburn while American guards stood by the exits, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, occasionally laughing at the same jokes that made the German prisoners smile despite themselves. The guards didn't even watch them particularly closely during the films. Why would anyone try to escape during the best 2 hours of their week? Where would they go? That was better than this strange democracy of darkness where captor and captive faced the same direction, toward the same flickering dreams. Brenner had been a schoolteacher before the war, had taught German boys about Teutonic Knights and Germanic virtue, about the superiority of German culture, about the decadence of American jazz and Negro music. Now he found himself tapping his foot to Cab Calloway, watching his men mesmerized by Duke Ellington's orchestra, seeing hardened veterans of the Eastern Front grin like children at Donald Duck cartoons that preceded the main features. The film program had begun almost by accident, the way momentous things often do, with a casual suggestion that took root in prepared ground. A YMCA representative visiting the camp had mentioned that other camps had started showing movies to prevent what military psychologists were calling barbed wire psychosis, the particular form of depression that seized men who spent too long staring at fences. The representative, a middle-aged woman from Boston named Mrs. Harriet Coleman, had seen too many hollow-eyed prisoners in too many camps, men who'd stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped doing anything but staring at the wire, as if they could will themselves through it or will it out of existence. She'd noticed how they gathered wherever there was distraction, a card game, a letter from home, a guard's radio playing through a window. She'd suggested movies almost offhandedly, the way one might prescribe fresh air for a persistent cough, not knowing she was prescribing something that would fundamentally alter the emotional architecture of captivity. The camp's American administrators had seized on the idea with an enthusiasm that puzzled their prisoners. Within a month, they had a full screening schedule, Tuesdays and Saturdays, 2 showings each night to accommodate the camp's 2,000 inhabitants. The films came from the same distribution network that supplied American military bases, a steady stream of Hollywood productions that arrived in metal canisters stamped with War Department approval, each one a small bomb of American culture ready to explode in German consciousness. What the prisoners couldn't have known was that this was part of a larger, barely articulated strategy that existed more in effect than intention. American military planners had realized something that seemed counterintuitive. Treating German POWs well might be more valuable than treating them harshly. Every letter home that described movies and decent food was a form of propaganda more effective than any leaflet dropped from bombers. Word spread through Wehrmacht units still fighting. Surrender to the Americans meant survival, meant dignity, meant Saturday night pictures. The letters went through Red Cross channels, were read by German military censors, were discussed in bunkers and foxholes across the collapsing Reich. Some German officers would later testify that soldiers in the final months of the war actively maneuvered to be captured by Americans rather than Soviets, and the movies were part of that calculation, a small but significant weight on the scales of surrender. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, an entire German platoon surrendered to a surprised American patrol, and their lieutenant's first question, asked in carefully practiced English, was whether the camps really showed films. When assured they did, he nodded as if a crucial matter had been confirmed, as if this detail validated his decision to lead his men into captivity, rather than fight to the death as his orders demanded, as if cinema could be salvation. The selection process for films became an unexpected window into American military bureaucracy and democratic ideals. Each month, a list would arrive from the War Department's Morale Services Division, titles typed on carbon paper with brief descriptions and content warnings, contains mild romantic themes, features comic violence, musical numbers throughout. The descriptions were written in the peculiar dialect of military cautiousness, every possible offense anticipated and cataloged. The camp's American cultural officer, Lieutenant David Weinstein, a former high school English teacher from Brooklyn, would review the list with a committee that included the camp chaplain, the medical officer, and, surprisingly, 2 German prisoner representatives elected by their fellow inmates. The Germans had voted for these positions with a seriousness that amazed their captors, campaigning on platforms of more comedies versus more dramas, debating the merits of musicals versus westerns. They would debate choices with a seriousness that belied the seemingly trivial nature of their task. Should they show the Philadelphia story when many prisoners came from destroyed cities? Would White Christmas be too painful for men who wouldn't see their families this holiday season? These discussions would stretch for hours, conducted in a mixture of English and German, with Lieutenant Weinstein taking careful notes as if he were planning a semester's curriculum, which, in a way, he was. He was teaching America through its dreams, its fantasies, its vision of itself, projected at 24 frames per second. The film selection itself became a matter of careful consideration, and revealed unexpected preferences that said as much about the prisoners as about the films. Westerns were universally popular. The landscape, the clear moral codes, the frontier justice seemed to resonate with men who'd grown up on Karl May novels about the American West. German boys had devoured these stories of Old Shatterhand and Winnetou, imagining themselves riding across prairies they'd never see. And now here they were, prisoners in that mythical America, watching Hollywood's version of those same dreams. The disconnect between the America of their imagination and the America of their captivity created a peculiar double vision, as if they were simultaneously in 2 countries, the real one that held them prisoner and the mythical one that entertained them. Musicals drew packed houses, especially anything with elaborate dance numbers. The prisoners would sit transfixed as Fred Astaire tap-danced across the screen, as if witnessing magic. Some would unconsciously move their feet, trying to understand the rhythm, trying to decode this American expression of joy through synchronized movement. A former ballet dancer from Berlin, now a Wehrmacht corporal, would later lead dance classes, teaching fellow prisoners steps he'd memorized from the films. Men who'd marched across Europe now learning to foxtrot in a prison camp. Comedies worked well, though slapstick translated better than verbal wit. Charlie Chaplin, though technically British, was treated as an honorary American, his little tramp character evoking laughter that needed no translation. War films were forbidden by general policy, though one administrator tried showing Sergeant York, thinking its World War I setting was distant enough. He stopped the projection halfway through when he noticed the profound discomfort spreading through the audience like a contagion, men shifting in their seats, some leaving quietly, others sitting frozen as Gary Cooper's portrayal of combat heroism reflected their own experiences back at them through an enemy's lens, through a narrative that made their sacrifice meaningless, their cause evil, their courage misguided. Private Heinrich Müller, 22 years old, from a small town outside Munich, had never seen an American film before his capture. German cinemas had banned Hollywood productions since 1940, replacing them with German films that grew increasingly propagandistic as the war progressed. His last cinema experience in Germany had been watching Kohlberg, a historical epic about German resistance against Napoleon, meant to inspire similar resistance against the Allies. The film had been lavish, expensive, using actual soldiers as extras even as the Wehrmacht crumbled, a desperate attempt to project strength through celluloid, to win on screen what was being lost on battlefields. Goebbels himself had overseen the production, declaring that a great film could be worth several divisions. Now Müller sat watching Rita Hayworth in Gilda, and later he would struggle to articulate the feeling it gave him, not just the obvious allure of Hayworth, but something about the film's assumption that life contained possibilities for happiness, for redemption, for second chances. The American films seemed to exist in a universe where problems could be solved, where endings could be happy, where individual desire mattered more than state decree. It was a universe that contradicted everything he'd been taught about American decadence, about the weakness of democracy, about the superiority of the German spirit. Yet there was something undeniably powerful about these stories, something that made even propaganda seem pale and forced by comparison. The American films didn't tell you what to think. They made you feel, and in feeling, think differently. The prisoners began to discuss the films obsessively, creating an entire culture of criticism and analysis that would have impressed any university film department. In the barracks, after lights out, they would dissect plot points, debate character motivations, attempt to parse the American psyche through its entertainment. They noticed things their captors took for granted. The casual wealth displayed in even modest American homes on screen, kitchens with electric refrigerators and automatic dishwashers, the way characters spoke to authority figures without cringing or clicking heels, the prominence of women in public life, the mixing of social classes at restaurants and nightclubs. A romantic comedy set in New York showed more about American society than any propaganda lecture could have conveyed. They saw telephones in private homes, teenagers with their own automobiles, black musicians performing for white audiences, immigrants running successful businesses, women managing corporations. Each detail was a small revelation, a piece of evidence that the America they'd been told about, violent, chaotic, racially poisoned, economically failing, was at minimum more complex than their leaders had claimed. Some prisoners began learning English primarily to understand dialogue better, forming study groups that met before screenings to review vocabulary that might appear. They would practice phrases, "What's the big idea? I've got a hunch. Let's blow this joint. He's a regular guy. She's got moxie." American slang became a secret language in the barracks, men trying on these foreign phrases like borrowed clothes, seeing how they fit, how they felt in the mouth, how they changed the shape of thought itself. The camp's German doctors noticed an unexpected phenomenon that they documented with Teutonic precision in medical logs that would later be studied by occupation forces trying to understand the German mind. Movie nights correlated with decreased medical complaints. The infirmary saw fewer patients with psychosomatic symptoms in the days following screenings. Men who had been listless, refusing food, showing signs of deep depression, would emerge from a particularly good comedy with something like their old selves restored. One doctor, Wilhelm Gerhardt, trained at the Berlin Charité before the war, wrote in his medical notes that cinema was proving more effective than any treatment in his limited pharmaceutical arsenal. He began prescribing movie attendance for severe cases of depression, writing 2 Filme pro Woche, 2 films per week, on prescription slips that became jokes among the prisoners, then actual currency, traded for cigarettes and chocolate when someone couldn't make a screening. Dr. Gerhardt developed a theory that the films functioned as a form of psychological escape that was paradoxically more healing than actual escape would have been. The men could leave their prisoner status for 2 hours, enter a world where they weren't defeated soldiers, but simply humans, watching other humans navigate love, loss, comedy, and triumph. This temporary forgetting, he argued in letters to colleagues that would never be sent, was essential to maintaining sanity in captivity. The films provided what he called emotional exercise, keeping the feeling parts of men alive when everything in their situation argued for emotional death. Colonel Morrison received a letter from the International Red Cross commending the camp's innovative approach to prisoner welfare. He filed it without comment, unsure whether showing movies to enemy soldiers was innovative or simply common sense. He had fought in North Africa, had seen German prisoners there treated according to strict military protocols, adequate food, shelter, medical care, nothing more. He had seen them wither in the desert camps, becoming ghost-like, mechanical, going through motions of living without being alive. But here, in New Hampshire, with the war clearly winding toward Allied victory, something different seemed possible. These men would return to Germany eventually. What they took back with them, memories of cruelty or memories of movie nights, might matter in ways no one could fully predict. He'd begun to think of the film program as an investment in the future, though he couldn't have articulated exactly what returns he expected. Perhaps it was simply the hope that men who'd laughed together in darkness might find it harder to kill each other in light, that shared entertainment might create bonds stronger than propaganda could break. Or perhaps it was simpler. Perhaps showing movies to prisoners was just the decent thing to do, and decency in the end was what separated the Allies from their enemies. The projection equipment broke in January 1945 during a showing of Going My Way. The film stuttered, the image froze, and then the bulb burned through the film stock, leaving a spreading black hole in Bing Crosby's face that grew like a cancer until the screen went white. The collective groan from 300 German soldiers was so profound that the American guards initially thought a riot was beginning. They reached for their weapons, prepared for violence, only to realize the Germans were simply devastated at the loss of their entertainment. The next day, a delegation of prisoners requested permission to examine the projector. Among them were men who had been electrical engineers at Siemens, optical specialists from Zeiss, mechanics who'd maintained Tiger tanks. They volunteered to repair the projector, working through the night with salvaged parts and German ingenuity. They cannibalized a broken radio, used wire from the camp workshop, fashioned a new lamp housing from a tin can, ground a new lens from a broken bottle using toothpaste and patience. The American guards watched in amazement as these enemies rebuilt their entertainment system with the same dedication they'd once applied to building weapons. When they succeeded, the camp commandant authorized a special screening of their choice. After heated debate that involved multiple votes and campaign speeches delivered in mess halls, parliamentary procedures borrowed from Weimar democracy, they selected The Wizard of Oz, which they'd missed during their ocean crossing. Grown men, combat veterans who'd fought from Poland to France, sat mesmerized as Dorothy clicked her ruby slippers, whispering, "There's no place like home." When the film ended and the lights came up, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then one soldier, a panzer commander who'd led tanks across the Russian steppes, said quietly in accented English, "We are not in Kansas anymore." And the hall erupted in laughter that was equal parts humor and heartbreak, recognition and loss. Some prisoners began to create their own entertainment inspired by the films, a flowering of creativity that surprised both captors and captives. A theater group formed, attempting to recreate scenes from memory, translating American dialogue into German, adapting stories to their circumstances. They built sets from Red Cross packages, costumes from blankets and uniforms, props from whatever could be found or made. Their production of a Western, set in the camp with brooms for horses and cardboard for 10-gallon hats, drew an audience that included American guards who laughed until they cried. The German who played the sheriff affected a drawl learned from Gary Cooper, while the villain twirled a mustache drawn with charcoal, delivering threats in German-accented English that somehow made them funnier. They staged shootouts with fingers for guns, deaths dramatic enough for any Hollywood climax, and when the hero got the girl, played by the smallest, smoothest-faced prisoner they could find, the audience whooped and hollered as if they were in Dodge City rather than a prison camp in New England. The boundary between captor and captive blurred in those moments. Everyone united in the fundamental human need for story, for escape, for the dream that life could be otherwise than it was. The plays became so popular that they began charging admission, a cigarette, a chocolate bar, a can of soup, using the proceeds to buy materials for more elaborate productions. Lieutenant James Patterson, responsible for camp security, wrote in his weekly reports that movie nights posed minimal escape risk, but noted something more complex that his military training hadn't prepared him to articulate. The prisoners, he observed, seemed to be escaping in a different way, not from the camp, but from the war itself, from the choices that had brought them there, from the ideology they'd served. He watched them, watching the screen, their faces illuminated by Hollywood light, and saw something he hadn't expected. Recognition. They recognized something in these American stories that transcended propaganda, that spoke to desires and dreams that existed before and beyond National Socialism. He saw former SS men crying during It's a Wonderful Life, Wehrmacht officers laughing at the Marx Brothers, young soldiers who'd joined the Hitler Youth as children now cheering for Jimmy Stewart. These transformations weren't complete or permanent, but they were real, moments when the enemy became simply an audience, when shared humanity flickered to life in the projector's beam. Patterson began to think of the movies as a form of denazification more effective than any re-education program, because they worked not through argument but through emotion, not through confrontation but through seduction. The films kept coming through the spring of 1945, even as news arrived of Germany's collapse. The prisoners watched Meet Me in St. Louis while the Battle of Berlin raged. They laughed at arsenic and old lace as their homeland was divided into occupation zones. Some wept during Going My Way, not at the film's sentiment but at the realization that the world it depicted, stable, peaceful, where the greatest crisis was a church mortgage, was the world that had conquered theirs. The movies had shown them America more clearly than any victory parade could have. A nation so confident, so prosperous, so essentially unburdened that it could spend millions making fantasies for entertainment while simultaneously waging global war. This casual display of surplus, of resources devoted to pleasure, even during wartime, said more about American power than any military demonstration could have conveyed. It suggested a society that could afford to dream, that considered entertainment essential, that believed even in wartime that life should contain joy. Wolfgang Ritter, a philosophy student turned artillery officer, kept a journal throughout his captivity that would later be published in Germany as Kino hinter Stacheldraht, Cinema Behind Barbed Wire. His entry for March 15, 1945 read, "Watched Double Indemnity tonight." The American capacity for self-criticism astounds. They make films about their own corruption, their own murders, their own moral failures, and show them to enemies. Either this is supreme confidence or supreme naivety, perhaps both. We were told Americans were weak, decadent, corrupted by jazz and racial mixing and democracy. But weakness doesn't produce such stories, doesn't examine itself so fearlessly. We told ourselves only heroic tales, permitted only glorifying mirrors. They show themselves everything, even their shadows. There is something profound in this, something I am only beginning to understand. A culture that can look at its own darkness without flinching may be stronger than one that sees only light. Their films contain murders, divorces, corruption, failure, all the things our films were forbidden to show. Yet somehow this honesty makes their society seem more robust, not less. They can afford to show their flaws because they're confident in their strengths. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, the camp's atmosphere shifted palpably, like a fever breaking. The prisoners were no longer enemies, but defeated men, waiting for repatriation. The film program continued, but now with a different tenor. The administration began showing films about American democracy, about rebuilding, about the future. Frank Capra's Why We Fight series appeared on the schedule, though attendance was optional. Some prisoners rolled their eyes at the obvious propaganda turn, but others watched intently, taking notes. These men would return to destroyed cities, to families who'd survived bombing raids, to a nation that would need to rebuild not just buildings, but its entire sense of self. Some wondered if they could create their own film industry, tell their own stories, find their own way to that casual confidence they'd seen on screen. They discussed whether German cinema could learn from Hollywood's techniques without adopting its values, whether entertainment and propaganda could be separated, whether stories could exist without political purpose. These discussions would influence the new German cinema movement decades later, as some of these prisoners became filmmakers, critics, distributors, carrying with them memories of movies watched behind barbed wire. The last film shown before the camp began repatriation was, at the prisoners' request, Casablanca. They'd seen it months earlier, but wanted to watch it again with new eyes, with the war over, with their fate decided. The irony wasn't lost on them. German soldiers watching a film about resistance against Nazis, cheering for Rick and Captain Renault, singing along with La Marseillaise. Some men wept during the singing scene, not from patriotic emotion but from the recognition of what they'd been part of, what they'd lost, what they'd never get back. When Humphrey Bogart delivered the line about the problems of three little people not amounting to a hill of beans in this crazy world, several men nodded in recognition. They understood now what they hadn't before, the American myth of noble sacrifice, of choosing principles over passion, of finding redemption through right action. As the credits rolled and the lights came up, nobody moved for a long moment. Then, slowly, Beginning in the back rows, applause began. Not for the film exactly, but for something harder to define. For the strange humanity of their captivity, for the country that had conquered them with bombs and canned food and Hollywood dreams, for the peculiar grace of spending the worst period of their lives watching the best entertainment their enemy could produce. The applause went on for minutes, Americans and Germans clapping together, until someone started laughing at the absurdity of it all. And then everyone was laughing and clapping, and some were crying. And in that moment, the war was truly over. The projector was packed away in June 1945, wrapped in army blankets and stored in a warehouse where it would gather dust until being sold as surplus in 1947 to a drive-in theater in Massachusetts, where it would show films to American teenagers necking in cars, never knowing it had once shown films to German soldiers dreaming of home. The screen was rolled up, the wooden benches redistributed to other camp facilities that would soon house displaced persons instead of prisoners. The German POWs began their journey home carrying Red Cross packages, cleared medical records, and memories of American films that would prove more durable than either. They would return to cities where rubble was being cleared, where occupation forces were screening citizens for denazification, where American occupiers had reopened cinemas as part of the Reconstruction program, where German audiences could once again watch Hollywood films, now with subtitles instead of memories, in proper theaters instead of prison halls. Hans Fischer, captured at 19, repatriated at 21, would become a film distributor in Hamburg in the 1950s, specializing in bringing American movies to German audiences. His company would grow to be one of the largest distributors in Germany, and he would always insist on personally viewing every film before acquisition, sitting alone in screening rooms, remembering. When asked why he chose this profession, he would tell the story of Tuesday nights in New Hampshire, of watching westerns with armed guards who laughed at the same jokes, of discovering that his captors' dreams weren't so different from his own. He would describe the first time he saw John Wayne draw a gun, not knowing who John Wayne was, not understanding the dialogue, but comprehending somehow that this was American mythology, their Siegfried, their Roland, and that being allowed to witness it was either an act of remarkable generosity or remarkable indifference, and that perhaps the distinction didn't matter. The movies hadn't made him love America, exactly, but they'd made him understand it. And perhaps more importantly, they'd made him understand that understanding was possible, that the gulf between enemies could be bridged by something as simple and complex as a shared story projected on a wall. That hatred was learned and could therefore be unlearned, one film at a time. Decades after the war, in 1995, a German documentary filmmaker named Thomas Becker interviewed surviving POWs about their captivity for a film that would air on the 50th anniversary of the war's end. His own grandfather had been a prisoner in Texas, had picked cotton and watched movies, had returned home with stories no one quite believed. When asked what they remembered most clearly, many mentioned the films before they mentioned the food, the guards, or even the moment of liberation. One elderly man, Otto Keller, a former paratrooper who'd jumped into Crete and survived the Eastern Front before his capture in Italy, struggled to find words, his aged hands moving as if trying to grab something from the air, as if trying to catch light itself. Finally, he said, "They showed us who they thought they were. But more than that, they showed us who we could choose to become. Every film was a window, yes, but also a mirror. We saw ourselves differently afterward. How do you return to thinking enemies are monsters when you've watched them cry at the same sad scenes, laugh at the same stupid jokes, fall in love with the same beautiful women on screen?" The war ended for me not when the shooting stopped, but when I sat in that dark room and realized I was enjoying myself, realized I'd forgotten to hate, realized that perhaps the most dangerous thing about Americans was not their bombs, but their assumption that everyone, even enemies, deserved a good story, deserved entertainment, deserved 2 hours of forgetting that the world was broken. The last German POW left American soil in July 1946, sailing from New York Harbor past the Statue of Liberty, seeing it not as conquered men, but as film audiences who'd watched it appear in dozens of movies, who knew its symbolic meaning better than some Americans. The films they'd watched remained, stored in memory like canisters in an archive, ready to be recalled, re-examined, reconsidered. Some would say the movie program was a small kindness in a cruel time. Others would argue it was strategic genius, a psychological operation that helped prevent prisoner uprisings and encouraged surrenders. Military historians would debate its effectiveness. Sociologists would study its impact. But perhaps the truth lies in what one former prisoner wrote in his memoirs. We came as soldiers and left as moviegoers. The transformation was neither complete nor universal, but it was real, measured in the accumulated weight of Tuesday and Saturday nights, in hundreds of hours of shared darkness, in the strange alchemy by which entertainment became something more than distraction, became a form of education that no propaganda could have achieved, became proof that culture could cross any boundary, that stories were universal, that enemies were just people who hadn't yet watched the same movies.